Well, we're continuing into John, and I've got John 12, and I want to zoom in on just a couple of verses and one concept. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honour the one who serves me. I called it Dying to Live, which I thought was a clever play on words, till I realised lots of other people had thought of the same thing. How do we die in order to live? It seems like a paradox, like something Yoda would say. But you can't get away from the fact that it seems central to Jesus' call. Bonhoeffer said, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. It seems to be part of the package, and not something for the elite, but right up front for everyone. Come follow me and you'll die, but then you'll really live. Well, really, living sounds good, and fruitfulness sounds good. We like the sound of that. But this dying and hating your life sounds hard. We're not sure what to do with it, and there's a lot of confusion out there. One approach is just to edit that bit out. And if you read a lot of Christian books or listen to messages, you'll basically hear the message without that bit in it. All the good stuff. And that's got to sound good to a hurting world, isn't it? All the good stuff. But taking that bit out is taking out the bit that really makes it all work. So, what does dying to self really mean? I thought I'd survey your knowledge on this. So, how well do you feel you understand dying to self on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is not at all and 10 is perfectly? So we've got any 10s? If there are any 10s, they can take over from me. Dave, I'll sit down.
No, I understand it, I just can't do it.
Oh, okay. That bit's coming up. Are there any above 7? Thank you. But as Dave reminded us, it's really about how well do you apply it. So the knowledge is not worth anything without the ability to apply it. So if there were a pair of 10s out there, you could take over. What I want to cover is basically, what is dying to self? Why do I have to die to self? How do I die to self? So, what is this dying to self? Essentially, it's a determination that we make once, and then again and again and again, that we will not live for ourselves, for the flesh, the old nature that drives us, but we're going to live for God. Or said another way, it basically means we want God to have control more than we want to keep it ourselves. There's an enormous amount of theology there. Paul talks about how dying breaks us free from the link with sin and all its consequences. And it's a package deal that the life and the power and the victory comes with dying. We abandon the old nature, the flesh. Galatians says it really beautifully, doesn't it? I've been crucified with Christ and I no longer live. But Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loves me and gave himself for me. So there's two I's. There's the old I, that I died, and there's a new I that's living with a new energy. So the prosperity doctrine sort of edits it out, but there's a sort of an opposite view out there that says basically the godly way is the toughest, hardest, loneliest, cruelest, driest way out there that you can imagine. And that's sort of an error in the opposite direction, isn't it? God does not delight in our hardship. He knows we've got an enemy within that would love to destroy us. It's a rotten old part that doesn't belong anymore, and we do have to get rid of it. Mother Teresa talked about this. We think of her as a sweet, godly old lady. But she said, now and again I see self in me. It rises up. And I have the chance to bash it. And she talked about times when someone says you'll do something without getting your consent. And that sort of instinctive reaction that rises up. She said that is almost purely self, and it's a rare opportunity right then to knock it on the head. Which made me think of this game. Yeah, I'll bash the moles, whack-a-mole, or bash the crocodiles if you've ever played that game. Except what are we bashing? We're bashing what feels like ourselves. That's the tricky thing, isn't it? It's that old nature that pops its head up and we bash it on the head. So it's a call to die, and marriage provides lots of opportunities for this, doesn't it? I remember sitting in an elders meeting in Burke, and the point of business came up that the Sunday school superintendent was stepping down. And I said, Karen would be really good at that. Of course, not giving it another thought and not telling my wife about it. So she runs into someone a few days later who says, congratulations on being the new Sunday school superintendent. How awesome of me to give my wife such opportunities to grow. But you don't have to be married to have opportunities. We get neglected, slighted, misunderstood, misrepresented, taken for granted all the time, don't we? If you're going to be around humans, that's going to happen endlessly. And if you're going to try to minister to humans, if you're going to try to love humans, then you're going to have all sorts of opportunities again. And one amazing opportunity is parenthood, isn't it? For a mother, it's just endless, isn't it? The demands, and the mother has a crash course in dying to self. She can feel herself being displaced by another. But God's built it so life itself keeps giving us these opportunities. Numerous provocations where self jumps up and we have the chance to respond to it. But dying to self doesn't mean obliteration of self. We die to self, those old fleshly passions, but not necessarily our convictions, our hopes, our dreams, our loves, our gifts. How do we identify what's self and what is not? Well, self has a flavour to it, a fragrance, a stink. Remember when your kids were little and wandering around in nappies, and we had a rule, whoever smelt it changed it. There is a stink like a dirty nappy when self is in control, when self has the reins. Say something hasn't gone like we planned, we feel like it's rained on our parade. Someone says something we don't like, we feel unfairly treated, overlooked, neglected. Someone else got the recognition we felt we deserved, and self rises up. Who can't relate to that feeling? That stubborn, grumpy, sulky self that wants to take the reins of our tongue and our heart. Self cares about others, particularly what they've got that we haven't. And self wants more. Self wants recognition. Self wants affirmation. Self just wants what it wants, the way it wants it. Self thinks God is actually pretty lucky to have us on his team. Self is very aware of its own spirituality and its own importance. It's pretty pleased with itself. That's the thing that we're knocking on the head. That's the old nature that we're bashing. And the idea's been captured nicely in this poem. When you are forgotten, neglected, or purposely set at naught, and you don't sting or hurt with the oversight, but your heart is happy, being counted worthy to suffer for Christ. That's dying to self. When your good is evil spoken of, when your wishes are crossed, your advice disregarded, your opinion ridiculed, and you refuse to let anger rise in your heart or defend yourself, but take it in patient, loving silence, that's dying to self. When you lovingly and patiently bear disorder, irregularity, annoyance, when you can stand face to face with waste, folly, extravagance, insensibility, and endure it, That is dying to self. When you are content with any food, any offering, any raiment, any climate, any society, any solitude, any interruption by the will of God. When you never care to refer to yourself in conversation, or record your own good works, or itch after commendation. When you can truly love to be unknown. When you can see your brother prosper and have his needs met, and can honestly rejoice with him in spirit and feel no envy, nor question God, while your own needs are greater and you're in desperate circumstances. When you can receive correction and reproof from one of less stature than yourself and can humbly submit inwardly as well as outwardly, finding no rebellion or resentment, that's dying to self. Most of us, when we think about that, we realise we've got a fair way to go, and like Mother Teresa, we know self is alive and well in us. So why do we have to die? We've really sort of answered it, haven't we? We've got this rotten legacy of an old way of living that remains and will stick around until glory. And what are the alternatives? To sort of accommodate, to pretend it's not as bad as it is, to somehow learn to coexist with it. Pretending's not a good strategy, is it? It does not belong. It has no place in the new life. But it's not necessarily the things we love, or our gifts, or our personality, or our temperament. Self is the flesh, that selfish bent in us that turns everything in on itself. God doesn't want to annihilate us. He wants us to be more us than we've ever been. And He works to make us that. Lewis says it like this: give up yourself and you'll find your real self. Lose your life and you'll save it. Submit to death. Death of your ambitions and your favourite wishes every day, and death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fibre of your being and you'll find eternal life. Keep back nothing. Nothing you have not given away will be really yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself and you'll find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin and decay. But look for Christ and you'll find Him, and with Him everything else thrown in. So Paul says, make no allowance for the flesh. Don't allow for it. In Romans, JB translates it, you can see we should have no particular reason to feel grateful to our sensual nature and to live on the level of those instincts. Indeed, that way of life leads to death. But if, on the other hand, you cut the nerve of your instinctive action by obeying the Spirit, you're on the way to real living. The flesh feels like it's a natural instinct. It rises up and it feels almost impossible to not follow its promptings. But you can learn to cut the nerve, as J.B. says. Spurgeon says it like this: I've now concentrated all my prayers into one, that I might die to self and live wholly to Him. So, how do we die to self? Well, the non-Christian doesn't really identify self. Self's just them. There's no distinguishing there. The immature Christian basically becomes aware that something's not right. They've been in a bit of a funk for a while, sort of grumpy, sulking, stuck in a bad mood, but they lack the power to change it. And they often have to rely on their mood changing over time, or circumstances changing. But as they grow, they start to become aware of this self when it takes over, and they can learn to displace him quicker. Karen's Dad Stafford told me a story about he got a letter, and it was an invitation to be a senior pastor of a big church on the Gold Coast. And they were about to start a big building program, be a lot of fundraising, and they thought that he would be the man to lead them. And he threw it in the bin. He said, there's so much about this that I don't like. Even the term senior pastor irked him. The whole idea of a giant fundraising program. And then his conscience pricked him and said, what if that was from God? What if that was an invitation to something that God wants you to do? And he thought, well, I hate building programs. I don't like the term senior pastor. The timing's all wrong for my family. But his conscience kept coming back. But That's just you. You haven't asked God about it, have you? What if this is from God? And he thought, well, if I ask God and he says yes, I don't want to do it. So he wrestled. He wrestled for a few days of being unsettled. And he was actually visiting Dalby. And he went for a walk along an old railway line where he'd walked before, much younger, and had done a similar wrestle. And he reflected that he'd always listened to God, he'd always obeyed God, and he'd always lived in the security, being where God wanted him. Was he going to change that now? Of course not. So he surrendered. He said, all right, Lord, I'm willing. What do you want me to do? What do you think the Lord said? Throw it in the bin. And he did. But those two seemingly identical actions are very different, aren't they? One of them prompted by sort of instant preference, and the other sort of hard one, surrender, and then obedience. Who can't relate to that? Who can't relate to wrestling with that? Wrestling with something that self wants to hang on too tight, doesn't want to let go, and we're afraid if we surrender what God might say. I have a friend who could do all that wrestling, surrender, struggle, repentance, in a breath. You'd see him, something would hit him, and you knew self was raging. And he'd take a big breath in, and you knew inside that was self rising up with all its rights and carrying on, and then he would remind himself that he doesn't belong to himself, he belongs to God. God's always been faithful, and he would surrender, and he would breathe out, and he was ready to go, full of the Spirit. That's spiritual breathing, isn't it? That's pretty impressive. Dying to self has been called the unlikely route to joy. But it's not that unlikely really, is it? When you think about what self wants and what happens when it's in charge. So the misery of man is self-will, and the secret of blessedness is to die to that and to yield to God. If self makes us miserable, less of self has got to make us happier. More of God in us and less of us, the old drama queen, complaining, bitter, jealous, proud. Less of that has got to be more of joy. In Cornerstone in first year, Marty and I shared a little caravan, and sometimes at night the work bosses would knock on the door. Someone hasn't shown up for night shift, and they need someone to go and do the night shift. And I remember those moments, being really tired, and the last thing you wanted to do was jump in a ute and go down the farm, but you knew what the right thing to do was. And I would open my mouth to say, okay, but no words would come out. And in that second, Marty would say, yep, I'll do it. The funny thing is, when you talk to Marty about those times, he remembers it the other way around. When you die to self, there's a sort of a humility that taints even your memories. So, how do we do it? What helps us to do it? What helps us exchange bondage for freedom? What helps us to do it sooner, faster, better? Well, notice that Stafford went to an old railway track, place where he'd won that battle before. And he made time, didn't he? This was the days before mobile phones, so uninterrupted, focused time and space for the task. There's a good tip. And he reflected on all the times God had come through for him. Sometimes the most persuasive thing about doing a hard task is the alternative. Remind yourself how miserable you are when self's in the reins, in the driver's seat, and you're just grumpy, sulking, and hate the world. Is that how you want to live? Or would you rather exchange that bondage for freedom? Remind yourself you've actually already settled this once and for all. The devil would have you redecide it every time, but it is over. You are settled, you've given your life to God. You don't have to redecide it. This is the time to reflect on scriptures that have been rich and powerful, times when God's been palpable in His presence. Music can help, can't it? Music can change our emotions. It's got a power to sway our feelings, to refocus us. Thank you, Al. John Stott says this about worship. It's the best antidote to self-centeredness, and it disinfects us of ego. In worship, we turn our minds and hearts and attention to God. And we turn away from ourselves. But that's hard because we're so used to turning in ourselves. We don't find it easy. But persevere, because nothing is more important. And of course, you're not supposed to do it on your own. The whole purpose of fellowship, friendship, is to encourage each other, to hold each other on track. Most, if not all, of what I've learned about dying to self has come from being close to people who are good at it, who love it and are eager to show what it's about. The trick for the Christian is, as they try to become aware earlier and earlier of self, that they might become self-focused, and that's not the point at all. Thomas à Kempis says, realise that you're living the dying life. The more you die to yourself, the more you can live to God. Or as this guy said it, Jesus gave His life for me, to take my life from me, to live His life through me. So you can get a little discouraged about this sort of ever-present, nagging, rotten old self. But it doesn't have to be so intense and serious. You can laugh at your old nature. Pete Vold taught me this. Laugh at him. His antics, his tantrums. You're actually getting rid of Mr. Stinky, and you're stepping into joy. And that's worth a chuckle. Well, what does it look like? Well, it could look like a lot of things. It could look like throwing a letter in a bin. In Karen's workplace, in day surgery, when patients are heading home and it's time for one of the staff to head home, often the other nurses are desperate to have their hours. So even though she's tired and her feet are sore, dying to self means going home. Or other times it means staying on. So dying to self looks like different things at different times. It might look like letting someone into traffic, spending time with someone who's a little bit awkward and difficult instead of people that you enjoy. Might mean opening your home to someone in need, giving up your time, your precious Sunday, going the extra mile, choosing simplicity. But dying to self doesn't mean saying yes to everything. It might mean sticking up for someone. Might mean conflict. Might mean asking someone to leave your home. Dying to self does not mean we are a doormat. It means we're energised by the love of God and not selfish interest. If you're going into bat for your own rights because you don't think God can look after you, then you're not dying to self. The reason we can die to self is God has our back. We can trust Him. It's worth knowing your own self. Sometimes we itch for conflict. We're dying for a fight. And in that case, dying to self might mean letting go of an issue. Other times, what self really wants is to avoid conflict, keep the peace. And dying to self might mean a confrontation. What makes it dying to self is what is driving us. If it is our preferences, our likes, dislikes, our comfort, our ease, then that's probably not dying to self. Dying to self is not doing the things that we like the most or the least. It's asking the Father what He would have us do, doing it in His strength. Homework. Can you guess? Just one. If it's all new and just starting out, then pick something simple, something small. Ask the Lord, where's an area in my life where self is reigning, where it's got its roots down strong, and think about changing that. If you've been at it a while, Try teaching someone who's maybe a little bit younger in the journey about it. Try spiritual breathing. See if you can do that in a breath. Try laughing as you bash Mr. Stinky. John Stott said, it's not easy because self has that addiction, but persevere.